People are alive today because of the new laws.
We need to go back in and redo things over again.
The Black Lives Matter movement, following the deaths of George Floyd and Manny Ellis, pushed state lawmakers to pass significant police accountability bills last year.
The pendulum seems to have swung a bit far.
But families of officers killed in the line of duty are pushing back, saying the new laws hinder police and undermine public safety.
Stop, please.
As lawmakers debate reforming police reform this short session, will officers end up with more clarity over the new rules?
We have to be able to do our job.
Our panel of experts weighs in.
There should be community insight or oversight.
We're not there yet.
Olympia's ongoing efforts to police the police. Next on City Inside Out. Welcome to this edition of City Inside Out. I'm your host, Brian Callanan. Last year, state lawmakers passed a slate of police accountability bills intended to define when officers can use force and what kind of force should be used in certain situations. But critics say those measures are restricting officers from doing their jobs and negatively impacting public safety, as evidenced by rising numbers of thefts, murders, and other crimes. That's led to an effort from lawmakers this session to reform police reform and find a challenging balance between holding police accountable when they uphold the law and holding suspects accountable when they break it.
Because it's not about these single cops, it's about the whole system.
In 2020, protests following the deaths of George Floyd in Minneapolis and Manny Ellis in Tacoma at the hands of police led to the Washington state legislature passing a dozen police accountability bills in early 2021.
It's going to increase confidence, decrease distrust, which is important to law enforcement, to decrease distrust so we can have more safety for everybody.
And while many saw the state's work to impact when officers use force and what type of force is used as a step forward, for Jill Brown, it was a step towards tragedy.
Honoring Jeremy every day in the way that we choose to respond to our loss has been kind of always in the forefront.
Just days after the legislation took effect, Jill's husband, a Clark County Sheriff's detective, was in his car conducting surveillance when he was shot and killed by one of the suspects he was after, who was accused of trafficking firearms.
At least one pursuit, just hours before he was murdered, actually was called off.
Brown says House Bills 1310 and 1054 passed last session, setting limits on police chases and other tactics, and requiring probable cause before an officer uses force to detain someone, limited her husband's ability to do his job, and are limiting law enforcement agencies across the state.
There's so much ambiguity written into these bills.
Reports show after passage of the police accountability measures, some agencies are now not responding to emergency mental health crisis calls, and others aren't sure when, if ever, they should pursue criminals. Brown, who recently left a job she'd held for 15 years in the public sector, says police accountability is essential, but lawmakers in Olympia have created a crisis.
Reform is necessary. I'm not here to tell you that it isn't. But the pendulum seems to have swung a bit far.
Representative Jesse Johnson, the Democrat from the 30th District in Federal Way, sponsored House Bills 1310 and 1054 and visited dozens of police agencies across the state after they passed.
It was about establishing a reasonable care standard for when force was going to be used that prioritized de-escalation and less lethal enforcement of the law.
Johnson admits there were some unintended consequences from his bills, and he's supporting new legislation to clarify when officers should be involved in mental health crises, how less lethal weapons like beanbag rounds can be used, and what type of force officers can use to detain a suspect fleeing from questioning.
We cannot simply allow for, folks that did commit a crime to just walk away.
Let's bring this down.
Johnson says he's weighing the public's desire for change, expressed in the police accountability measures approved in Initiative 940 4 years ago,
Say yes on 940.
and the critical job of maintaining public safety.
We're trying to create a balance between protecting individual liberties and also holding people accountable who did actually commit crimes.
We've got to repeal some of these laws.
State Republicans are calling for a new approach.
We have the same concerns. We have a different way to get there.
Gina Mosbrucker, the ranking Republican from the 14th District in Goldendale, says the state needs to respond to a recent jump in criminal activity and what the GOP describes as Democrats dropping the ball on public safety last session.
That's not acceptable. And we see crime rising. We need to go back in and redo things over again.
The Republicans' Safe Washington package of 50 bills takes aim at what the GOP calls several flawed anti-police measures adopted by Democrats in 2021.
So ordered.
Mosbrucker says public safety is not a partisan issue, and she and other lawmakers are trying to build the public's trust in how officers do their jobs, while also responding to advocates who want to keep police powers in check.
Building that trust back is, I think, my number one concern. There's a lot of emotion because there are community members who've lost someone they would arguably say at the hands of police, and we have to address that.
It's an attempt in Olympia to find some middle ground for many who've suffered losses in the unfolding story of police accountability, a story that truly can only have one ending.
It shouldn't be this or that, us or them. It has to benefit everyone.
And joining us to discuss this very important topic, we have with us Leapi with the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have Enoka Herat. She is an attorney with ACLU of Washington. Thank you for being here as well. And finally, Chief James Schrimpsher from the city of Algona. He's also the vice president of the Washington Fraternal Order of Police. Chief, good to have you too. Let's jump into it. And Chief, let me start with you if I could here. Governor Inslee, as you know, signed 12 police accountability bills into law last session. The governor called this a solid foundation for progress, but in practice, we've heard from law enforcement agencies across the state saying there are some ambiguities here. It's not clear how to put some of these laws into effect. Tell us what's been confusing for police to start with here. And in general terms, do you support the changes to these bills the legislature is talking about this session?
Yes. Last legislative session, there were sweeping changes brought on by the legislature to the law enforcement profession. And like with anything that you do that sweeping, there's going to be adjustments on the back end to provide some clarifications. There were a lot of hesitancy and I wouldn't say misinterpretation, but strict interpretations of certain things that were passed last session that caused a lot of confusion for the rank and file officer all the way up to my colleagues, chiefs and sheriffs. And so this session, we're very supportive and very grateful for the laws that have or the laws that are making their way through, the clarifications, so that peace officers can get back to serving their communities.
Okay, and we're going to break down some of those changes in a little bit. But let me go to you on this one. You have a personal connection to this issue. Can you briefly talk about that, please? And also help us understand your stance on some of these changes to the police accountability laws that are being talked about this session.
So I'm here because my cousin was shot and killed by Seattle police officer Jared Keller on December 31st, 2018, post I-940. Since then, I've been kind of a spokesperson for the family out here learning things, seeking information, truths, meeting with folks I wouldn't typically meet with, engaging in conversation. So I believe we're here because there's been a lack of accountability and transparency. And I believe along with accountability, there should be community insight or oversight and engagement, not just oversight, but the ability to influence and impact and engage from a community standpoint is very important to our family and our community. So that's why I'm here.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Enoka, I'll go to you here and just kind of phrase the question this way. Over the past year, the number of people killed by police in our state dropped by about 62%, which advocates would say is a sign these accountability measures are working. But in that same period, we've also seen a big jump in criminal activity. We've seen spikes in homicides, property crimes, gun violence, too. The ACLU, I know, says that law enforcement must protect public safety and the rights of individuals. But in looking at those numbers, do you think, as some of the state Republicans have said, the pendulum has swung too far? Your thoughts on that?
I don't think we need to choose. I think it's a false choice to have to choose between preventing crime and people's civil rights. I mean, these are issues that courts have dealt with for decades, and law enforcement and community members have dealt with for decades. And I think there's a way to both give law enforcement the clarity they need while also protecting the civil rights and reducing police violence and reducing harm.
Are you seeing the changes that are put into effect to make some adjustments to these laws passed this past year? Are those in accordance with what you're talking about?
Well, I agree with the chief that some clarification was needed, and there are bills that do just that, clarify the intent of the legislature from last year, and I think will help with implementation. There are other bills, however, that roll back the policy and are, we think, a huge step backwards on racial justice, on reducing police violence, and on police accountability. And so we don't support those.
Chief, let me go to you here. I want to talk about House Bill 1310. So this passed last year, was intended to prevent the use of excessive force and discriminatory policing in our state, but it's led to a situation where officers have, in some cases, simply stayed away from cases where they'd normally be involved, like mental health crises and involuntary commitment calls. Since there's no specific criminal activity, some agencies interpreted this as we shouldn't respond at all. So looking at this session, we have a few different bills in play here. I'm thinking of 1735, which passed through the House, 5919, which just passed the Senate recently, to modify the standard for the use of force. What option makes the most sense to you to give cops the clarity they need and really to ensure police departments are on board?
I'll take 1735 first, which was the clarification around peace officers responding to behavioral health calls. Fraternal Order Police, we're the oldest organization in the country that represents law enforcement. We fully support that bill. It provides that clarification. Again, 1310 was passed, and you had a myriad of interpretations on how 1310 affected behavioral health calls. You had a majority of us that said, hey, we can still respond to behavioral health calls, but you also had other organizations that took a very strict interpretation of that and decided, hey, we can't respond to behavioral health calls. What 1735 does, it provides that clarification. It makes it crystal clear. We can help our dedicated crisis responders. We can help our for EMS people, our firefighters, and it allows us to be part of that bigger behavioral health approach. So great bill. 5919 is a bill around reasonable suspicion. And as of last night, it also included pursuits. Allowing pursuits for certain circumstances, which they've been strictly prohibited after last legislative session. The FOP has never taken a position on the pursuit part of that bill. However, the language that is in 5919 as far as being able to do investigative stops, we feel is a good piece of legislation, and it makes some clear distinctions of when officer can use a investigative stop or a Terry stop, and so we too support that fully.
Okay, thank you. And we have a lot to pull apart here. And Poe, maybe I can go to you here. Do the coalition support what the legislature's working on? We talked about a few ideas here, clarifying when officers should get involved. The pursuits here too with 1735 and 5919. Some thoughts about this and what the legislature's talking about?
From our communities and in our experience, when it comes to reasonable suspicion, it's been everything but reasonable when applied to our communities. So we have a huge problem with leaving it up to them to find that reasonable suspicion or reasonable suspect through their lens. And so we strongly oppose anything in that manner, anything with that approach. We believe that probable cause is the way to go. My cousin was racially profiled in a predominantly white neighborhood and pulled over. On camera, they said he looked shady, and a conversation surrounding that comment was never had. There's a lot of things that we experienced through my personal life in regards to racial profiling. Just real quick, I had a Cadillac DeVille for 15 years. I got pulled over a dozen times. I traded that in for a Fiat, a 4-door Fiat, cherry red. I've never gotten pulled over in that car. My windows are tinted. That's all I got to say.
Okay. Thank you for breaking that piece down. Enoka, I want to talk about these different options with you, 1735, 5919. If you can try to split apart some of these issues for us and respond to what Poe was talking about, this idea of reasonable suspicion, probable cause, a lot to pull apart here.
1735 is one of those bills that clarifies the intent of the legislature. Clarifies that certain authorities weren't taken away from law enforcement and that law enforcement can show up in these situations. So we're supportive, and that bill has universal support. Where we are concerned is with 5919, because exactly of what Poe has been saying. But this is, and what it would do is it would allow officers to use physical force on any investigatory stops. And investigatory stops, as the chief said, are based on reasonable suspicion, which is the lowest level of evidence connecting someone to wrongdoing. It's just more than a hunch. And that's where we see so much racial profiling. And we know, the data shows across the state that that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are stopped at higher rates already. And so to authorize officers to use force in that situation, even if they're cooperating, is a huge expansion on when officers can use force, and many people's civil rights will be violated. So we don't think that's a good solution. We think it's very harmful and expands when officers can use force, and it's going to increase police violence, especially at those really low level offenses. And it's open also to all traffic stops, even traffic stops based on civil infractions like expired tabs or having something hang from your rear view mirror. So we're very concerned about that.
Got it. Chief, is there any sort of middle ground here? I know you have some concerns, at least, about 5919. Any middle ground here? Reasonable suspicion, probable cause? These are some interesting terms to wrestle with.
Thanks. And I do agree that we don't want to go back to the broader approach, and to address what Poe and Enoka both said. One of the things that the FOP has supported is that we make it very clear when we conduct one of these investigative stops that the officer should be have the responsibility of saying, "Hey, this is why I am contacting you today. This is an investigative stop. You're not free to leave, but you're not under arrest. I'm suspecting there may be criminal activity afoot," and making a clear distinction of when they're doing the stop, why they're doing the stop. From our perspective, that does that puts some sideboards on it, and it forces the officer to have communication with the community, and so that there's a better level of understanding. Also, the FOP has never supported bias-based policing practices, anything like that, and we've always believed that our profession should evolve, and part of that evolving is listening to the community that we serve and being able to reactive. At the same time, we have to be able to do our job, and investigative stops are a key portion, are a key component of being able to do our job and responding to those. I'll use the example here in Algona. A lot of commercial area, 1 o'clock in the morning. My officers have to be able to contact those people that are behind a closed business and be able to do those things as long as they have articulable circumstances, why they're doing it. And I totally agree with Enoka and Poe that we should not be stopping people just because they drive a certain car or they have something hanging from their window. That is not professional policing, and nor should it be condoned.
Yeah. Poe, I just wanted to ask you about this. What does that look like? What does the right kind of action look like from an officer? They see something that might be suspicious to them. A lot of times these officers are right. Some of the research has shown they're right on their suspicions to begin with, but that interaction is the difficult part. Can you help me with that? What does the right interaction look like between an officer and someone they suspect of doing a crime?
I think it goes down, it all boils down, for me, it boils down to the lens of the officer and how they perceive the individual or the person that they're interacting with. I work private security, and it's important for me to approach as a guardian, as a community member, as kind of looking out, not so much a warrior in a combative way, and I feel a lot of our communities have experienced that mannerism. And I feel just engaging, and looking at folks as family. It's that serious, and for me as a private security guard, I look at folks as family, and it's that level of passion, love for security, safety, all that is embodied in that person. And a lot of officers don't embody that when they encounter folks, and That's what we have a serious problem with. It's
Okay.
just that the core of where they're coming from, and that's where their motives lie, that's where their agenda lies, and that's where we want to hone in on.
Okay, thank you for that. Enoka, I want to go back to you for one piece here, just taking this a step further. Let's say House Bill 1735 passes through here. By July of this year, the state attorney general would have to develop and publish policies about use of force and de-escalation tactics. Then, by December, law enforcement agencies would have to adopt that model or a set of policies consistent with that standard. I'm just thinking about this. If this measure indeed does pass, what's that implementation process going to look like? And are you confident that this new, I guess, use of force standard would get where it needs to be?
Again, we support 1735, which has those provisions in it to clarify the bill. And so I think that'll help with the Attorney General's office model guidance on it, and it'll help with implementation. It'll answer a lot of questions that people had from before. So I think that will all make it easier to implement. And I believe if passed, that law goes into effect immediately.
Right.
I think some of the other bills that are expanding the use of force will actually lead to more confusion because they do contradict the constitutional standard.
Okay. Let me jump in. I think the question I was getting at is just the implementation of it. Passing a policy is great, but actually having officers buy in on it and implement it is a big deal. We saw a lot of these concerns after I-940, for that matter, a couple of years ago. Help me out with that part. What's it going to take to actually get these officers to do what the legislature's asking them to do?
Some of this is about culture change, and some of it is new, and culture change takes a while, and change takes a while to get used to. But most of the practices that were enshrined in 1310, the use of force law, were based on best practices that we are already seeing across the state, that the Criminal Justice Training Center, our state's police academy, were already training around, especially around de-escalation. Officers have been trained on de-escalation for years. And so I think a lot of it was just making it clear, because before this law, each department had a different policy on what using force looked like, et cetera. So this just clarifies as a statewide standard, and it'll be easier, I think, in that sense, to train on going forward.
Got it. Chief, just a thought on this one. Policy is only as good as it's implemented. Do you think there's going to be enough buy-in here for these policies to go through, whatever comes off the table here at the end of the session?
Great question. And I can only speak for my colleagues that I work with here in South King County. I can tell you that we, after last legislative session, we dedicated a lot of time, energy. We had a lot of meetings. We collaborated, all 9 cities, and we came up with some consistent policies. And I have no doubt that if 1735 was to pass and the AG's model policy comes out, that we will do the same. And we appreciate the fact that now there's going to be a consistent standard throughout the state. And we would agree with Enoka that it's very hard to have training that brings up one set of standards, and then when you get to your department, there's a totally different set of standards. I'm an old farmer. I grew up on a farm. If you want to get a better product, you got to dig up the roots, and you got to plant new seeds. And so it all starts with the training, all right? And that's how you get the better product. And so I think that's a good first step.
Got it. Thank you for that. I wanted to touch on one other issue. Enoka, let me go to you on this one. House Bill 1054 last year talked about what tools can be used when, beanbags, tear gas, things of this nature. I know officers have been looking for some clarity on this too. Talk to us about this, kind of these different tools that are used, less lethal weapons or whatever else. Has this discussion gone away? The ACLU has wanted it to go this session?
Again, there are bills in this session that clarify the intent of the legislature on 1054 on the tactics bill. One of those is 1719, which clarifies that, of course, the legislature didn't intend to ban less lethal alternatives. And we're supportive of that. And I think, again, that has universal support. But then there are other bills like HB 1788 and 5919 that passed last night that would expand when officers can engage in vehicle pursuits. And we oppose that because vehicle pursuits are inherently dangerous. After shooting, they're the leading cause of officer-involved killings in Washington state. And most of the people who are killed in vehicle pursuits are uninvolved bystanders, pedestrians, other drivers, and passengers.
Right. Poe, just your thoughts on this one. This whole concept of vehicle pursuits sounds like there's a really thorny issue here. Some thoughts about where the legislature should take this?
I think a huge step is just to remove reasonable suspicion from it all. The entire formula, it doesn't work. My hope is that agencies will kind of view our folks as human, and that's, it's kind of the short answer.
Okay. All right. And we do need to start wrapping up here. Poe, thank you for breaking that piece down here. Chief, maybe I can start with you here, because we've seen a situation over the past couple years here where really polarized groups have disagreed but stayed at the table for the most part here. Do you think we'll be any closer this year to having police accountability measures in place that answer some of these concerns that Poe and Enoka have brought up here, and also that police agencies will buy into? Where does this conversation go over the next couple months and the years ahead, do you think?
Well, thanks, Brian. And what I would say to that, and both these I've met with quite often, and it's the continuation of that conversation. Do I think if whatever happens in this legislative session is going to derail that conversation? Absolutely not. Are we going to continue to work on solutions together? Absolutely. I feel very comfortable with this panel talking that, yes, we will continue to have those conversations. And I think that's where we really move the ball forward. Instead of approaching things in a polarizing way or adversarial way, we approach things together and try to solve issues together and listen to everyone, and so I think maybe I'm being over optimistic, but I don't think so. I think we're going to continue to have those good conversations.
Okay. Poe, some final thoughts to wrap up here. I know you've been concerned about some of these issues of police accountability getting rolled back here. Some thoughts about this, where we go from here, what you want the people in our legislature to know as they make decisions on this in the weeks ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me as well. It's empowering to be heard. And I encourage everyone to make space and a platform for those with lived experience and just to have conversation. I believe dialogue goes a long way, and I believe it's enlightened me in a lot of ways. And I feel like talking to us and us talking to you and sharing, I think will enlighten a lot of folks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Enoka, some last thoughts here. I know this conversation about police accountability has been going on for decades all over our state here. We've seen some important changes on these issues over the last couple of years. This debate's certainly far from over here. By the end of this session, do you think we'll have a system that protects public safety and the rights of individuals too in a better way?
We all want to live in a safe community, and I don't think we need to sacrifice the civil rights of especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous people to get there. And right now, some of the bills that are moving, we're really concerned they do just that. And so we hope that the legislature will listen to impacted community members like Poe and the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability to try to find a solution that does thread that needle, that gives officers the clarity they need while still protecting civil rights. And we're not there yet.
Okay. All right. A lot ahead in the next couple weeks in the session in Olympia, so we'll be watching that. Thank you all for your participation here, and we will be right back. What are people saying on social media about the effort to reform police reform in Washington? One person writes, "These bills are unnecessary. The police do not need this additional authority to use force. This reverses the progress we have made." Another says, "Law enforcement wants to be a dynamic force for good, for compassion, for safety, for respect, and for fairness for all." We'd like to know what you think. Send us an email at contact@seattlechannel.org or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Coming up next week, the controversial effort to find missing middle housing in Washington. Governor Jay Inslee wants to allow more duplexes and fourplexes by mandating multifamily zoning across the state. Many city leaders are pushing back, saying a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. We take a look at Olympia's efforts to solve the affordable housing crisis on the next City Inside Out. I hope you join us.